Welcome to Queer Art Podcast. This interview series documents the prodigious yet visually dissonant work of LGBTQIA plus artists. My name is Christopher Stout. I'm a New York City artist and the creator and moderator of this series. By sharing the perspectives and life stories of trailblazing elders and rising voices, I hope to broaden our understanding of both the aesthetics and the people defining contemporary queer art. Thank you for listening. Welcome, friends, to Queer Art Podcast, Season 1, Episode 5. I'm thrilled to be joined in our studio today with artist Eric Sutphin. Hello.
Hello. It's great to be here.
I'm excited that you're here. Let's kick off our discussion with some short icebreaker questions. In addition to the title of artist, which letters from the LGBTQIA plus acronym would you like to claim?
I'd like to claim G and Q.
Tell me why.
I identify as a gay man and I am part of a queer community.
What are your preferred pronouns?
He, him.
For how many years have you been making visual art?
Consistently and in earnest, 30 years, about 30 years. So since I was sort of a preteen.
We have some time here. Describe the physical aspects of your art, but in layman's terms. What types of art do you make? What specialized processes or technologies are used? What materials are your go-to materials?
Yeah, I like to say I do painterly figuration with forays into abstraction. Now, I realize that is sort of outside of the realm of layperson's terms, but what that means to me is painterly refers to a kind of uh, process-oriented work that kind of shows evidence of its making, so surface, texture, paintings that uh, demonstrate that they're paintings. And figuration meaning there are clear references to things that exist in the world. Not just figures, but objects, still life. So some grounding in tangible experience. Um, Now I push those either toward abstraction or toward representation. So it's kind of a pendulum that swings between just varying degrees of legibility to what the original idea is. And so um, I work in a few different modes. So the primary kind of overarching mode is oil on canvas, pretty straightforward oil paintings on canvas. Um, then another kind of segment of the process is um, I do a lot of studies, like preliminary works that stand alone, but gouache, I like gouache, which is an opaque watercolor and watercolor. So I do a fair amount with those. I'm really in love with drawing. So in charcoal in particular, I like very kind of active, um, developed charcoal drawings. I do a lot of figure drawing. I love attending figure drawing classes, working from live models, working from in the landscape. So we've got like paintings, oil on canvas. We've got smaller works on paper in wet media. We have drawings and charcoal. And then sort of the fourth pillar for me are collages. And the collages often integrate a little bit of everything that I've just mentioned. So I take paintings that I've maybe create like oil paintings on paper, for example, that are unsuccessful, are not really into, or never get resolved, but I keep them and I cut them up or tear them up. And so those become kind of the base for these collages that take on lives of their own. And within those collages, I often integrate charcoal drawings. So they're sort of like repositories. They're collections of all of my favorite media that kind of go into this one mode. So, um, yeah, so we've got, yeah, so those are sort of the four primary pillars of my practice.
Um, that is a completely perfect articulation of the work that we're going to see shortly. I feel like you must be shooting this episode in your studio. Can you tell us where you're working and talk a little bit about where you make work?
Yeah, so I currently live in Western New Hampshire, in a rural part of New Hampshire. Um, it's about 20 minutes from Hanover, which is where Dartmouth College is. So it's kind of, there's some access to, um, there's some access to community and art and galleries and museums, but I am in a pretty rural part of the state, and my studio is in a converted room in my home.
Has living in that area impacted the content of your paintings at all? And maybe this would be a great time just to put some paintings on the screen and talk about it a little bit,
Yeah.
if I may. I've known you for years as a New Yorker and a New York painter. And then a few years ago, you made the choice to move to a different locale. Did it change your work from a content perspective?
Yeah, I'm trying to trace it. I don't actually think the content changed that dramatically. I think the content is still there, but the form it takes is a little different. I think
I feel like your palette's the same.
yeah, the palette has remained the same. I think the color has gotten a bit lighter, and maybe a bit looser in execution, but that's probably not entirely true. But yeah, I think the content has been pretty consistent, and the way that I work has been pretty consistent.
So we're going to get to know your practice by looking briefly at three images. If you'd be so kind to walk us through the title, the year it was made, and one or two key facts. Here's the first image from 2018. Take it away.
Yeah, so this is Little Bacchus from 2018. Um, the original impulse for this work was reading uh, a Greek tragedy by Euripides called the Bacchae. And the Bacchae is a really chaotic and strange story about Bacchus showing up and kind of demanding to be worshipped, and it has all of these themes of kind of power dynamics, um, familial drama, pageantry, sexuality, and so it's just a really wild story. And I've always been drawn to this figure, this character, Bacchus. And it has a long tradition of kind of, Bacchus or Dionysus is, I think, queer coded in a lot of ways. And, in original texts, Bacchus is gender fluid and moves between genders and, is also, the god of wine and kind of partying, basically. And so, he's just, Bacchus is just a wild character. And so this particular painting is a good example of my practice in the sense of was spurred by a literary interest or a kind of poetic interest. And at this time, I was working out of a studio with the Rosemary Beck Foundation. So I had a residency at the Beck Foundation, and Beck was a New York painterly figurative mid-century artist who worked with literary references, Greek tragedy. So I was very steeped in that milieu, and so that by extension was certainly rubbing off on me. And so this painting was created during that time. And so it started with this literary scaffolding. I was working at a bar at the time, and there was one of my coworkers was this beautiful bodybuilder who was a bartender, and he was, working on being a competitive bodybuilder and loved posing and modeling. And I, got gutsy and asked him if he'd be interested in posing for me, and he was. And so I had this great series of figure poses with him over the course of a few days, did a lot of drawings. And so the drawings that I did of him then incorporated themselves into, a year's worth of paintings, kind of through the pose, the gesture, the sense of sensuality. So, that man, that friend is in this painting as the kind of skeleton of this creature. And then the still life objects that are here were objects that were physically in the space that I incorporated often and used as a kind of, stand-in, these kind of dynamic, almost anthropomorphized objects, and then a kind of invented. At this time, and even presently, I really am interested in and uh, pulled toward spaces, interior spaces, or painting spaces, two-dimensional spaces that flicker between interior and exterior. So paintings that feel as if you're on the threshold of something between two worlds, between, nature and civilization, or between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. But this kind of notion of threshold, interstitial spaces, I think this painting is one of the more successful demonstrations of that for me. And so that idea, that philosophy, that framework of threshold has continued into my current paintings.
Got it. Excellent. Here's a second painting called Studio Corner. Can you walk us through that briefly?
Yeah, this is from a few years ago. It's pretty small. It's, I think, 11 by 14. And this is one of those paintings that the previous painting we saw was worked over many sessions over a long period of time, lots of revision, and finding the form. This is one of those magical moment paintings where it really flew off the brush. I had this little setup in my studio, and I say it flew off the brush, but really this painting came about because I'd been drawing and doing other studies of this kind of similar setup over weeks. So this happens sometimes where I can work on a subject over, many sessions, and maybe sometimes do a very labored or belabored painting of a subject. But then the next painting, because I've embodied that setup and I feel so familiar, I am in that world, I've internalized it, that sometimes I do something, um, and it just flies out. And it's not, and I couldn't get there. I couldn't have arrived at this painting without intensive study over a period of time. I can't there's no shortcut to that kind of spontaneity, which is the paradox. And this is a paradox that I'm interested in when I paint. And it's a paradox that I think the kind of blueprint, or the pinnacle of that mode, is Robert De Niro Sr., who was a mid-century painter, and the father of the actor Robert De Niro. And he was a gay man. He was closeted for, I think, most of his life, and but it's since, been written about, posthumously. Although I think the estate maybe is a little shy about making foregrounding his sexuality too much. But I think when we're talking about queer art, um, De Niro Sr. is a fabulous example and someone who I've looked at a lot. Not necessarily because of queer connections, I think to me that is secondary to the formal aspect, this aspect in his work of paintings that look so spontaneous, like one shot, but that are actually worked on over long periods of time that have this incredibly dense history in them. And there are objects in these paintings that are repeated over and over again over, years, decades, and sometimes. And these objects have become kind of stand-ins for the self or for romantic interest. And so this is where there's like a bit of an intersection, I think, of queer history, because when I think about De Niro and this using objects as kind of archetypes for either lovers or the self or experiences like this, I always think about someone like Marston Hartley, who has been um, his queerness has been mythologized at this point. The idea of the calla lilies standing in for, love interest and all that. So I'm there's a romantic aspect in me that's, even though on some level it's tragic that artists had to uh sublimate their sexuality and code it. I think that there is actually something kind of fabulous about that, on a formal level, and it's something that I do in my current work.
I'm going to throw in a final image. This one's called Bend.
Yep.
This one is, these are painted, I guess, a year apart. They feel
Yeah, they're
very different,
fairly
but they're also
recent.
the
Yeah.
same. Um, what can you tell us about this one? Squash, it's collage.
Yeah, so this is one of those paintings that is an amalgamation of different media. It is,
I'm enthralled. I don't see any seams, and it's labeled as
oh,
collage. I just find all that very exciting.
oh yeah, I think, well, I have something called a bone folder, which is a bookmaking tool that,
I'm familiar. Yeah.
yeah, it's wonderful. It's not actually, I don't think mine is made out of bone, but it's for getting really crisp seams in paper, and I use it to burnish the surfaces of these collages. And that's part of the pleasure of making these is, there's the physical aspect of arranging the material and creating the image, but then there's also this other finish process of working over the surface to achieve some kind of um, patina or continuity. And so, this is one where I had, torn up fragments of paper that I just sort of intuitively respond to. And when I was talking about kind of getting rid of these older paintings on paper, a lot of times there are sections or windows of the paintings that are fabulous and wonderful and I want to covet. And so this is one way of doing that and preserving them. And often those wonderful sections, and that could be, for me on this in this particular work on the left hand side, um that large rust swath that's there with that sort of half arch shape, that to me was a really exciting passage. And just that bend in the arch, I think that was the first thing that I slapped down on the edge. Kind of putting something to the edge creates, I think, an immediate tension. So I mean, I move these things all around and just kind of feel out where it wants to live, and then from there, kind of all hell breaks loose. And I wish I had a real, this is where the kind of there's a certain expressionistic impulse here, and these paintings I think are the most, in some ways, like cathartic or healing or I mean, I don't necessarily like to frame them like that, but they are liberating. There's a lot of liberation because I don't adhere to an idea necessarily or an image. Rather, I let the accumulation of material start to kind of determine the form. And so that's just where this kind of funky, bent over central butt-like figure kind of came. And it is, I think, on the edge of just on the cusp of referencing the body. And so um, it just feels really satisfying to me. Like that shape. Sometimes the shape just exists and feels right and satisfying.
This is so specific, but you brought it up. Reference. I see a Marston Hartley chest.
Oh, I see it. Yeah, 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 totally. I mean, there's this kind of clunky,
Yeah,
hulking thing.
square. Yeah,
Yeah.
it feels almost like a weapon. Let us change course because I feel like we've done a good job of teaching about the visuality of your work, but also the thinking encompassed within your work. Let's talk about you.
Yeah.
Um, when did you experience your first deep connection with art? And when did you realize that art would become your profession?
Yeah, I grew up in this small, funky town in New Jersey. It's called Frenchtown, New Jersey, and it's one of these river towns along the Delaware River that, is kind of antique-y and quirky, and there's art galleries. And so there's this kind of series from kind of like Philadelphia up to, north, where these little towns. And so this is one of those towns. And so I grew up around a lot of artists and shopkeepers, antique store owners, frame makers. So this community was just kind of packed with artists and artisans and craftspeople. And so when I was there was not a ton to do as a kid in the town. And so I think as a burgeoning gay kid, I was drawn to aesthetics and lovely things from a very young age. I mean, one of my favorite games was like playing shop, and like arranging objects from my grandmother's house in these tableaux as like, kind of like lovely little shop window displays. So anyway, so growing up in this town, when I was young, 11, probably 12, 13, like preteen, me and my friends would just walk around town and go into these shops and stores and galleries and a lot, and talk to the people. The people were, very welcoming. And so, and I think sometimes, there were like gay men who had the shops. And I think now in retrospect, like they looked at me like this little like 12-year-old arty kid and were like, just, someday you're gonna figure it out. And so they would like let me hang out. And when I think about it, it's like amazing. Like we would spend all this time talking to the shopkeepers, looking at the stuff, and so I
There's an
think,
interesting merger here. I'm going to interject for a second because the
yeah,
next question is when did you begin to understand your sexual orientation? And I'm getting a blending of answers. You can take them separately or you can continue with the merger, but I just like for some people this process is the same thing and sometimes it's distinct. Your
yeah.
process is sounding more like they rode in the same car along together.
Yeah, I think they began in the same sort of ferment, but then there was a dovetail where things changed and then things intersected again. And so um yeah, so really, it as a preteen and then as a teenager, like later as a teenager, I started to really get to know the artists. And so there were some artists, like there was this one woman named Jennifer Mizuko who started up kind of a youth group for art artistic kids. And she had this creative space. It was her studio, and she would host these gatherings of young people, and we would make things. And, she would facilitate these creative evenings. And, that she introduced me to painting with watercolor. I mean, that period was really pivotal. And then, there were a couple painters. One was Jane Nash, and then John Schmidberger, who were and then Trisha Vergis. They were local painters, and I worked for each of them at different points, like kind of as a gopher, studio assistant, or art transporting things. And so yeah, I think that was my first little glimpse into the idea of these were all working artists. They were artists who had studios, who were making living, making their work. And often they would have kind of a side hustle as maybe one of them made signs, like traditional carved signs and gilt signs. So, and then another one made picture frames, and another one was a faux finisher for homes. And so, yeah, I think that time was really where I realized that this is a world that I might one day exist in.
Tell me about your coming out process. I'm not talking about the actions per se, but more about the self-realization.
Yeah. Yeah, so I would say there was the first kind of glimmer. Well, I think some I became conscious of my sexuality, or that something was, I'll say, different, um, when I was 12. Pre-puberty is just the time when things start to happen. And so I remember very clearly being about 12 years old, being at a silent auction, a silent church auction with my friend. And we were just, there, and there was a boy, maybe a year or two older than me, at a piano, like tinkling away on the piano keys. And I had this intense feeling of attraction, of just wanting to be near him, wanting to be him. There was this kind of feeling of like, I just had this conscious thought of I want to be him. But it was I didn't have language for, I want, I'm attracted to him. It was this, I want to be him. I want to merge with that. I want to be that. And so, that I just pin that moment as my kind of awakening. And then, um, I think where my the where things really took off, I did after I graduated high school. I went on a trip to the UK and France, and so in London and Paris. I was 18 years old, and I discovered like the gay nightlife scene, and kind of gay underground scene. And that was it. Once and it's because I was headed to college, in a couple months. And so once I kind of connected to that, stumbled onto it almost, I mean, I'll say, by chance, but I think subconsciously I was probably rooting around for something. But yeah, I mean, that was it. That just like blew the lid off of everything. And so, that was pretty wild. And then, in terms of, formal coming out, it kind of happened clumsily in my early 20s. I think I was like 20, where, my parents, I think, intuited. I mean, they knew. And so they asked my sister, I think, if I was gay, and she said, yeah, she's younger than me. And so she kind of outed me, but I almost was kind of relieved, because then my parents wrote me this letter, and they were like, it's, this nice letter. And so it kind of, you know, it took the agency away from me in some ways of like actually doing the process. But, once it was out, it was very liberating.
Talk about the relationship between the art that you make and your queer identity. Is there one? If so, what is it?
Yeah, I think for me, it's twofold. So there's I can attach queerness to particular kinds of forms and the feelings that different forms and affects and gestures might evoke. So this might be a kind of private uh, index of sensations that occur in work that I can identify as or code as queer. And then there's overtly queer subject matter. In my case, often gay subject matter that deals with same-sex, male to male desire. And so these two things sometimes exist independently, sometimes connect. But I would say there's always one of these things present in the work. And so I think I touched on being a young person and being in all these shops and without kind of falling into essentialism. For me, I identify with this sort of almost Baroque aesthetic language of gay tradition of, beautiful things, arrangement, um, aesthetic experience, beautification, arranging, color, texture, pattern. So to me, these things can be queer coded. And this act of arranging and staging, which happens in my studio, in still life, in these tableaux where things are choreographed together, be it, a figurative drawing of a beautiful man with a literary reference that deals with same-sex desire or gender fluidity, and then this posture or pose that is coded some way. And so um, that's another element. And then I think the third element here is this, and it's a bit more of an abstract idea, but it has to do with longing and desire and connection and intimacy and also looking and seeing. So it's I put a lot of desire into the work that I make and a lot of tenderness and this kind of feeling of wanting. And I think it goes back to that experience with the boy at the piano of like, I want that. I want to be that. And so I think by putting romantic or sexual or intimate subjects together, it's a way of kind of holding on to it or recreating these, kind of wonderful moments where I might see, it could be as simple as seeing a beautiful man walking down the street, and there's this kind of frozen moment of a gesture, of a look, of a pose that could give way to a painting or a series of paintings. And so, um, and that connects, for me, there's a direct relationship between looking, like not just seeing things, not just looking or seeing things, but this intense, almost scopophilic, like this scopophilia of really intently looking and being aware of being looked at. I think that is something that um, is present in the being rooted in observation, perceptual painting, this idea of perceptual painting where the paintings are based in visible experience, the scene and lived experience. And so I think that is kind of another point of contact with my queer identity.
Excellent. Um, so the final question in this section is taking all of this to its next logical outcome. What do you hope viewers are able to better understand about the world from looking at your work?
Well, I think I really I really love ambiguity and also the tension between clarity and ambiguity. And so I want people to be able to be comfortable with some levels of ambiguity and realize that not everything is going to have defined outlines or edges or borders, and that's okay. That there is more gray area than I think we give ourselves permission to experience. Um, I think a lot of contemporary art really privileges um, the uh, I'll say an easy read or something that is kind of um, instantly recognizable, something that doesn't require a lot of unco decoding or unpacking or um, reflection. And so I think, on some level, I do hope that I would like people to really experience my work in a way that is embodied. And so to give people a chance to reflect and look at the evidence of its making and think about not just the image that's revealing itself, but how it got there. It's probably a tall order, but it's okay.
Um, so what I want to do now is shift course a little and invoke all of this personal information and perspective, put some more art on screen, and do a deep dive. We've been able to enjoy your thoughts on Little Bacchus, Studio Corner, and a third work called Bend. Now that we understand a little bit about you personally and your approach to making work, we're going to look at a final image, or in this case, a series of images, because you provided some studies that led up to the final work.
Yeah.
So share the story of this work. What happened that led you to make it? And I'll let you tell me how and when to toggle back and forth between the studies and the work itself. So just prompt me to help you talk about the work, please.
Yeah, I think so when I moved up to rural New Hampshire a few years ago, I was feeling somewhat isolated, and there was definitely not the queer community that I was used to in New York. And so, um, kind of in seeking out queer spaces, I found this swimming hole in Vermont where lots of all types of folks go, but it does have it's a very inclusive and just wonderful Arcadian space. And so I go there in the summer and into the early fall, and I just really have grown to love it, and it's just this wonderful space. And so sometimes when I go, I will sketch people, people that I've gotten to know, and you just see these fleeting encounters. You see a lot of intimacy, connection, coupling, and it's just really celebratory. And I wanted to, uh, just kind of dig into that in work and reflect on it over the course of a series. So these two works, one is a more observation-based drawing, and then the other is something that I did back in my studio, which is, kind of broken down into these shapes and masses. And um, it led up to a series of oil paintings, one of which we will see in a minute. So while these are sort of, they're preludes to an oil painting, they're complete works in themselves, and I call them studies.
There's the painting, if you can see it on screen.
Yep. Yeah, so this is Rock River Two Figures, and so this is, based on the same kind of dual pose. but obviously it's kind of broken down and abstracted to greater extents. And I was really going for sensation and affect and feeling, and this was made toward the end of the season into maybe early October. Uh, or the series began in early October, and I think I finally completed this at the beginning of this year. And so I was not referencing photographs. I wasn't really even concerned about creating any kind of faithful representation of figures bathing in the water, but really uh kind of just throwing together the sensations that I feel when I'm in this space. Golden water, golden trees, reflections of all these myriad colors that occur, patterns that happen in water, patterns that occur in the woods that are reflected in the water. I mean, there's so much visual information going on that it kind of, when I'm there, it just sort of becomes almost an abstraction. And that's the experience that I have when I'm recreating these scenes in the studio is um in some ways I just kind of give myself over to the sensory experience of thinking about how I felt when I was standing in the water in October on a very warm day, and everything was kind of golden and red and this on the cusp of, summer and fall, and just the kind of magic that happens in this Arcadian wonderland. I think it's opened up in a way, and the figures are obviously opened up. They become, I was playing with breaking down, I guess you would say cubist ideas, which obviously are not new, but they're still fun.
This is such a perfect setup for the next question. I'm going to leave this up on screen, even though I'm going to change into the final section. When I say the words queer art and put those words together to become one word, what does that mean to you personally? I certainly understand a lot of art world definitions for it. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think calling back to something earlier that I was saying, it's this two-pronged thing of art that embodies a kind of queer experience or demonstrates a kind of felt, lived, embodied experience through its forms. I realize it's hard to really delineate what a queer form might look like. I think it's one of those, you know it when you see it, or I'll say I know it when I see it. I know it when I do it. And then there's art that embraces queer subject matter, which I think this painting does both of these things. I think it embraces a certain level of ambiguity and being outside of the margins, of legibility, of what one might expect from a figurative painter of I'll say two men in the woods in a river in the fall. But there is an article from 2019 by Travis, I might butcher his last name, Travis Yepesen, who is a critic, and it was an article about queer abstraction. And it's a difficult article in the sense of it doesn't provide any clear answers, but it demonstrates the wrestling with this idea of queer art and the slipperiness of it, but also for me, the delight in that slipperiness and that um, it's one of those things, the term or the concept of queer art, once I grasp it or if I look at it too long, it kind of fades away or gets out of or evades me. It's being kind of in the margins of normative experience, heteronormative experience. And so I think it embraces queerness at the same time as it evades easy classification.
The final question I always ask is if there's something that wasn't covered through the course of our conversation that you'd like to share about your practice as a final thought.
Yeah, so I don't, this doesn't necessarily relate directly to my practice, but it's something that I'm thinking about in relation to this idea of queer art in general. And so I, I just, as a thought experiment, I was asking myself, okay, if I, as a queer person, were to take a photograph of a landscape and trace that photograph onto a canvas and paint that in a very kind of out of the tube, straightforward, classical manner with no expression or mm, just a very kind of flat rendering of that landscape that I photographed and were to hang it on a wall, I ask myself, what evidence of queerness does that work bear? Does it bear anything? Is that a queer work of art? I think this is the question of where people kind of butt against this idea of queer art is, does it have to look like something specific, or is it simply by extension of the maker being queer makes it a queer work? So if I look at this landscape that really has no evidence of kind of any formal attributes that I might have in my mind as queer coded, and without access to knowledge of the maker or the maker's background or identity, what of it then? And I don't know that there's any real answer to this question, but I think this is one of the ciphers that one can get kind of lost in and swirl around in when we're thinking about queer art in general. Um, and I don't pose that as necessarily a problem, but what I think for me in thinking about queer art over years, we've been in varying iterations, kind of wrestling with this question and this topic. I think for me, it's precisely that constant slippage and slipperiness and the ability of the topic to evade classification. I think in some ways that the very nature of the question of what is queer art makes it queer because there are no borders or defined parameters, and it is something that or I should say the parameters shift and are permeable and porous. And so I think those are the things that I'm interested in. And so, um,
Within your work or within the
well,
artisan
yeah, that's a
art
good
in
point. Like,
general?
right. I'm speaking to kind of more generally the idea of queer art right now, but as I'm saying this, I'm thinking, how does this relate to my work? And how it relates is it's that leaning into ambiguity or this kind of pivoting, this tension between resolution and ambiguity, and kind of this flicker between subject meaning and physical sensation, pure kind of erotic energy. And so that matrix is kind of where my work fits into the idea of queer art. And frankly, I just like the fact that this question of queer art, queer abstraction has been part of my life and part of our conversation and part of a bigger social conversation. That to me is the important part. I think the fact that the construct of queer art has been able to galvanize a group of people over, we'll say, decades as at this point, and continues to provoke questions and conversation, collaboration. Um, I mean, some of the most meaningful collaborative projects I've worked on, conversations have stemmed from this idea. So for me, that is really a core component and why I feel that this question, whether or not there's an answer to it or a definition that one could put in a textbook, um, it's more about the generative aspect of the question and the form of queer art. My hope is that in 10 years' time, that is still happening. People are still wrestling with this, investigating it, poking at it, challenging it, writing articles and white papers about it, curating exhibitions about it. Um, and certainly it's going to shift over generations, but I like to think that, some of the groundwork that artists working now have laid will be looked at in retrospect in a decade, 2 decades by a new generation. And the things that have been talked about and made now or a decade ago are going to contribute to a different iteration of the same topic.
So what I'm hearing you say is that in the defining of queer art, you are more excited by the potential created by the question than the framework created by an answer. Is that fair?
I think that's a fair summation of my point. Yeah,
Wonderful.
I think queer art as a social space and as a site of inquiry is what makes it so exciting and important.
I always find it a privilege and a learning experience to talk to you. And I feel, as I feel at the end of every episode, that you've created this need for people to see your work, but also to be able to have access to more of your thinking about your work and about art in general. Can you please share social or web handles that people can see more about your work? And also, if they exist, how do people learn more about your writing or things of that nature as well? And
Yeah,
where
so
should people reach out to you?
yep. So my website is ericsutphin.com, just full name.com. And there you'll find a portfolio of work of my painting. You'll also find a collection of my writings that I've done over the
Excellent.
years. So a full, links to all of the writing that I've done, as well as a section of links to curatorial projects I've worked on. And so you can pretty much find out everything about my work and career at ericsutphin.com. And then on Instagram, it's at eric.sutphin. And that is, mainly my own work and also, curated selection of exhibitions and other work that I like and admire and see. So my email address is ericsutphin@gmail.com, and it's also linked through my website and Instagram. So you can reach out to me by any of those methods.
Wonderful. Eric, it's been a joy. And
Absolutely.
thank you so much.
We've reached the conclusion of this episode of Queer Art Podcast. My hope is that our conversation has added a useful layer to your understanding of queer art. Please share this with your own creative community. Eric Sutphin's art and contact links are listed on the left side of the screen. Ours are on the right. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next time.